What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome get ready with me video. Except, as you can tell by the fact that my face is already made up, today will technically not be a gruesome get ready with me. But before I get into all of that, if you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica, and typically every week on this channel I sit down here and talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. However, given my recent technological difficulties and the fact that I'm filming on a loaner camera that I have absolutely no experience with, today I just want to be focused in right here, making sure everything is going smoothly. And then as long as everything does, and once I get my bearings with this loaner, or once I get my actual camera back, we'll be back to gruesome get ready with me's as scheduled. Because I don't know about you, but I really do much prefer to be keeping my hands busy while I talk. So if true crime and makeup sounds like something that you might be into, I'd say subscribe because, like I said, sooner rather than later, we will be back to that normal combo. And with all of that said and done, what do you say we go ahead and get into today's case? All right, so today we're going to be discussing a missing persons case, and this case in particular has perplexed the people of Portland, Oregon and the surrounding area for almost 15 years at this point. At one point, it was even ranked the largest search and rescue operation in Oregon's history. Today, we're going to be discussing the 2010 disappearance of Kyron Horman, which is still a case that I pulled from the request archive. However, I cannot thank this requester by name because they, like I believe last week, have also requested to remain anonymous. So thank you, mystery friend, whoever you are and wherever you may be. Thank you for requesting this one. Oh, and heads up, before I begin, this is gonna be a long one. There is so much information available out there about this case, and I did do my best to try to origami the thousands of pieces of information that I was able to find into one digestible and easy to follow outline. Just with the nature of the case, it's gonna be a lot. So get comfy, grab a snack, grab a drink, and buckle the fuck up, because this one is a roller coaster. All right? So before we can really get into who Kyron was and into the details surrounding his disappearance, everything is going to make a whole lot more sense in the long run if I first give you kind of a rundown on his parents, his family, and everyone's dynamic with one another. So starting with his parents, Kyron Horman and Desiree Young. Kyron and Desiree met in April of 1996. Kyron asked Desiree on a date after approaching her at a bar. She accepted his offer and the two began seeing one another. However, their relationship was seemingly never without its issues. I don't have a lot of details, but it seems like they were kind of always on again, off again. But no matter how many times they broke up, they always seemed to find their way back to one another, and ultimately they officially tied the knot on July 15th, 2000. However, what's actually crazy about their wedding is that Desiree tried to go straight up runaway bride. Yeah, she told her sisters that she could not shake the feeling that she was making the wrong choice, and in her lacy white dress, Desiree actually took off and tried to sneak out of the building. However, before she could get out, she was intercepted by her soon-to-be mother-in-law, who ultimately ended up calming her down and convincing her that she should go through with the marriage. It's worth noting that Desiree had been married once before Kyron. She also had a son from her first marriage, so maybe she was just really worried about ending up in another bad marriage, and maybe the thought of having to put her kid through another divorce was just more than she could bear. So maybe she felt it was best to just abort the mission, so to speak. Obviously, that's just my own speculation. Only Desiree truly knows how she was feeling in that moment, but it doesn't really matter because, like I said, Kyron's mother was able to talk her down the aisle, and she did in fact become Mrs. Desiree Horman that day. Following their nuptials, they, along with Desiree's son, all settled down together in a cute little house in Portland, Oregon. And they might have had their problems, sure, but one thing that Desiree did always appreciate when it came to Kyron was how well he got along with her son. From the time they had first met, while he and Desiree were dating, and throughout their time together, he was always a positive father figure in his life. Kyron worked as a software engineer, and Desiree worked as an accountant, and together they were doing pretty well for themselves. To outsiders looking in, they seemed like a beautiful, happy, loving, and successful couple. And those who knew them personally expected them to live a long and wonderful life together. But as is the case in many of these stories, although things appeared to be going well, behind closed doors, they actually pretty quickly started to go to shit and fall apart completely. And this all really came to a head one day when Desiree found out via a phone call with his best friend that her husband was having an affair. They had barely been married for a year before they started talking about separating. But before they could pull the trigger, in early 2002, Desiree found out that she was pregnant. And at first, Kane, not into it. He even went so far as to offer to sign over his parental rights to his unborn child to Desiree. And as you might expect, this was a crushing blow to her. But just like on their wedding day, just as things were about to fall apart, Kane's mother stepped in and worked her magic. Like, I don't know what kind of negotiation skills this woman has, but she seems to be able to get whoever to do whatever. She should be on some sort of like SWAT team or FBI hostage negotiation team or something.
She's like a conversational wizard.
After talking to his mom, Kane actually ended up apologizing to Desiree, and he told her that he did want to be a father and that he did want to be in their child's life. So in February, the two began seeing a marriage counselor, and they started trying to piece together what, if anything, was left of their marriage. But unfortunately, they were just never able to get things back on track. Not that they ever really sounded all that on track to begin with, considering the whole Julia Roberts Desiree tried to pull on their wedding day, but regardless, at this point, Desiree really was done for good. She filed for divorce in August of 2002, just 1 month before she and Kane's first child was due. Kyron Richard Horman was born on September 9th, 2002, and before he was even a year old, Kane and Desiree's divorce was finalized, citing irreconcilable differences. They were granted shared custody of Kyron. However, from what I could gather, it kind of seems like he was with Desiree a majority of the time at first. That is until tragedy struck. In 2004, after multiple trips to the hospital, Desiree was diagnosed with kidney failure, which obviously required her to undergo significant medical treatment. And if you know anything about anything, the last place that you want to require significant medical treatment is America, which is something that Desiree came to realize fairly quickly into her treatment. So in an effort to explore other avenues of treating her illness, Desiree actually began traveling to Canada to meet with different doctors and to undergo alternative treatments. And it should go without saying that this would have been very difficult for her to do with a toddler strapped to her hip, so it kind of became necessary for Desiree to hand over temporary custody of Kyron to Kane while she got her health under control. Thankfully, the treatments Desiree was able to access in Canada did the trick, and they helped to get her back into a stable place. But by the time she got to that point, she was still recovering from all of the things that her illness had put her body through. Not to mention that she was now also drowning in medical bills. So for just a little while longer, she and Kane decided that Kyron would be better off living full-time with him. Don't get me wrong though, she did do her best to maintain a relationship with Kyron and to remain in his life. She just wasn't at the right place, physical or financial, at that time to resume shared custody of Kyron. And this was difficult for Desiree for a myriad of reasons. I mean, no loving mother wants to give up custody of her child because she's too sick to care for them. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But another issue that Desiree had with this arrangement was Kane's new wife, Terry. Because even though she too would go on to happily remarry to a man named Tony, Desiree never really warmed up to Terry. Now, whether this is in relation to rumors that Terry and Kane started seeing each other prior to the end of Desiree and Kane's marriage, or in relation to something else, well, I suppose that's up to interpretation. But for whatever reason, Desiree and Terry really never seem to jive with one another. And I think that actually speaks volumes to the type of person that Desiree was, to think that she was willing to put her own feelings aside for what she believed was in Kyron's best interest, even if it meant him living full-time with her ex-husband and the woman who was in all likelihood at least partially responsible for the dissolution of she and Kane's marriage. She put all of that aside because regardless of how she felt, Desiree truly did believe that Kane and Terry could give Kyron a better life at the time than she was capable of doing. And it is just so devastating that making this like selfless of a sacrifice would actually be something that Desiree would come to deeply regret, but we are not quite to that point of the story yet. So before I get too ahead of myself, let's get more acquainted with Terry. Terry Moulton Horman was born on March 14th, 1970. After her birth, she was shortly adopted by Carol and Larry Moulton, whom were both teachers living in the Roseburg area, roughly 3 hours outside of Portland, Oregon. Terry met her first husband, Ron Tarver, while attending Umpqua Community College, following her 1988 graduation from Roseburg High School. The couple was married in 1991, and they had one son together in 1994 before ultimately divorcing in 1995. Then from there, Terry met and married a man named Richard Ecker in 1996. And although Richard actually ended up adopting Terry's son from her first marriage, their relationship as well ultimately soured and the two went their separate ways, leaving Terry single and ready to mingle when she and Kane first crossed paths. Now, unfortunately, we know that at that time, Kane was not single, but either way, we know how things shook out from there. Terry actually ended up moving in with Kane like as soon as Desiree moved out and into her own condo. Terry just moved right on in, right into the home that Kane had once shared with Desiree. The home that Desiree envisioned she and Kane would raise their family in. And this was in December of 2002, before Kane and Desiree's divorce was even finalized yet. Terry and Kane claim that this was platonic and solely in order for her to help him care for Kyron in Desiree's absence, but I don't know about you, but I ain't buying that. At first, though, it really did seem as though Terry was taking her role as like bonus mom very, very seriously. Her first son even stated once during an interview that the only difference between her relationship with Kyron and her relationship with him was the difference in their ages. Beyond that, though, most people who knew them would tell you that Terry treated little Kyron as if he were her very own. Terry, by the way, also happened to be a teacher, and this actually really ended up coming in handy as Kyron started growing up. She taught him sign language by the time he was like 6 months old, and she was actually the first person to realize that Kyron was having trouble seeing. And sure enough, when she brought this up to his pediatrician, turned out that Kyron did in fact need glasses. So, I mean, it's kind of easy to see why Desiree was so trusting of the fact that Kyron was being well taken care of, living with Kane and Terry. After about 4 years of living in the original house that they shared, at the end of 2006, Kane and Terry moved out and they relocated to rural northwest Portland. And this was about a 30-minute move east. Terry found a house that she absolutely loved on Northwest Sheltered Nook Road. And after Kane saw the secluded forest property, he too fell in love. And in January of 2007, their little blended family settled right on in. And then just a few months after that, wearing nothing but they bathing suits, Kane and Terry officially tied the knot on a beach in Hawaii. Once again, to everyone from the outside looking in, they seemed as though they were blissfully in love. Kane even bought Terry a brand new candy apple red Ford Mustang GT as a Mother's Day present. I can't even remember what I got for this past Mother's Day, and Kane out here buying this broad a brand new Mustang, complete with the vanity plates and everything. Actually though, I wouldn't be caught dead with vanity plates. I hate vanity plates. Sorry, but I think most of them are just so incredibly stupid, Terry's included. Her vanity plate read RDSQRL, which was a condensed down version of Terry's cute little nickname, Red Squirrel. Listen, we've heard some abhorrent pet names in other videos on this channel before. Yes, I'm looking at you, Bunny and Snuggles. But if my husband ever, and I mean ever, nicknames me after a rodent, you want to talk about your irreconcilable differences.
D-I-V-O-R-C-E. Divorce.
But Terry, on the other hand, she loved her car, she loved her vanity plates, and she loved the husband that gave them to her. Even taking to Facebook to post a picture of her new whip, captioned, "Something shiny for the driveway." And then underneath that picture, or to the side of that, how does Facebook work? It doesn't matter. She commented on her own picture saying something like, "Yes, Kane is all that and a bag of chips." So yeah, she was feeling it, which I mean, Go on with your bad red squirrel self. Does this just sound like a tacky spy name? Red squirrel in position. Over. Ooh, speaking of positions that Miss Red Squirrel found herself in 2008, one of those positions resulted in she and Kane's first child. Their daughter, Kiera Ariel, was born in November of that year, and as much as Terry loved showing her daughter off via Facebook, apparently behind closed doors, Kiera's birth seems to have had a fairly negative effect on Terry overall. For starters, evidently she suffered from a pretty intense bout of postpartum depression following Kiera's birth, which I can wholeheartedly empathize with to the umpteenth degree. I gave birth in February of 2022, and when I tell you that I white-knuckled it through almost every single day of my life for at least 5 to 6 months after, I mean it. That shit is rough. And throughout this postpartum time frame after giving birth to Kiera, Kane claims that this is when he began to see some pretty serious changes in his wife. She went from being nurturing and maternal towards Kyron and her son James to just angry and short-tempered. Allegedly, she would frequently just lose it on both boys as well as on Kane. Terry also, around this time, went from bragging about how wonderful her husband was all over social media to dragging his name through the mud to her friends about how awful he'd become. She claimed that he was controlling and degrading and mean to her, all of which Kane denies. The only thing that he kind of agrees with is that he was controlling over how Terry spent money because she was making none and spending tons. She hadn't worked in close to 2 years. However, she continued to spend money that they didn't have, like water, according to Kane. The relationships within the home had actually become so strained as Terry's mental health declined that after an argument in February of 2009, I believe, she actually sent her oldest son back to her hometown to live with her parents. And although he claims that this didn't really affect him, like that he just kind of took the situation on the chin, I just don't see how being, 14 in your teens and being shipped off by your mom because she, quote, can't handle you anymore. I don't know, it does not seem like it'd be great for ye old self-esteem, but maybe I'm just more sensitive than most. I don't know. So by 2010, which, believe it or not, is actually when the bulk of this story takes place, even though I feel like I've already been talking forever, but by this time frame, the Sheltered Nook Road home consisted of Kane, Terry, 7-year-old Kyron, and Kiera, who was just shy of 2. And although everything that we've gone over up to this point doesn't necessarily paint the most stable picture of Kyron's first few years, overall, he was still an incredibly happy and well-adjusted child. Sure, he was shy when it came to strangers, especially adults he didn't know, but I feel like that's pretty typical of most kids. Especially if you got the same stranger danger teachings that I did as a kid. Good Lord. They had us out here thinking that every person we did not know was in fact out to kill us. So yeah, Kyron was introverted and he felt most comfortable when he was home or around his family, but I don't think that that's really too outside of the norm. Once you got past that though, and you got to know Kyron, he just seems like such a charming and charismatic little boy. He loved camping and fishing and going out with his mom and his stepdad Tony on their boat. He was witty, he was funny, he was super smart. He could easily keep up with conversations and jokes between the adults around him. I mean, at just 7 years old, he already seemed as though he was wise beyond his years. He was fascinated by science and by forensics, and he even hoped to maybe someday become a detective just like his stepfather was. Oh, and he also really excelled at math. He was placed in an advanced math class at 7 years old. Truth be told, after helping my son with his homework, I probably couldn't hack it in an advanced 7th grade math class now, at 31. But we all have our strengths, and science and math were Kyron's. So you best believe that when his elementary school's end of the year science fair rolled around, Kyron was pumped. In 2010, Kyron was enrolled as a student at Portland's Skyline School, which was a K-8 building comprised of just around 300 students. Kyron had chosen to do his project on the red-eyed tree frog, working tirelessly on his research and his presentation board. both of which he was so excited and proud to display for his peers to see. And although the science fair was scheduled for June 4th, I believe, the actual projects were due in before that. The kids were supposed to bring their projects in, set them up, and present them to the class first, and I believe that's what they were graded on. And then the projects would all be set up for simultaneous viewing at the science fair on June 4th, which is when the parents and family could come and see all of the displays. Now, sadly, as much as I'm sure that Kyron would have loved to have shown his finished project to all 4 of his parents, Terry was actually the only one that was able to make it to the science fair that day. Desiree and Tony both lived and worked 4 hours away in Medford, Oregon. They typically had Kyron every other weekend. And then Kane had to work that Friday mornings, the morning of the fair. He did promise his son that he would make it up to him, though. He caught a moment with Kyron right before he left for work that day, and he made sure to tell his son how proud he was of him. He told him how wonderfully the project had turned out, and he promised him that later that night they would celebrate all of his hard work by going out for a treat and then playing video games together. Obviously, Kyron was super excited about these plans. I mean, what 7-year-old wouldn't be? So when Kane told him goodbye and that he loved him, Kyron excitedly replied with, "I love you too, Dad," and then the two of them parted ways. Unbeknownst to Kane at that time, though, those words, "I love you, Dad," would be the last words that he would ever hear his son say to him. Now, Friday, June 4th, 2010 was a very busy and bustling day at Skyline School. Clearly, we know that the science fair was happening that day, but there was also a school-wide talent show taking place that day as well. So it was crazy in that building. The school had opened early that day so that students and their parents could tour the science fair, and there was also a massive billboard outside of the school welcoming family and friends and inviting them to walk in and come through the science fair and to attend the talent show. All this to say that security in the school that day was not what it typically was. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of unfamiliar faces all throughout the building. That combined with the typical flightiness or maybe willingness to let things slide more because it was the end of the year. Whatever the case may be, things were just a little bit lax. Okay? Usually people would have to sign in and show their ID before they would even be allowed into the main areas of the school. Shoot, it's like trying to get into the Pentagon to get my oldest out of school. I feel like Gerard Butler and Olympus Has Fallen every time I have to take that kid to the doctor.
I'm scared.
Me too.
And don't get me wrong, I am beyond grateful for the safety measures that his school has in place. The problem here is that on this day, the day that Kyron disappeared, Skyline School was not operating their average protocols. So when Terry, Kyron, and Kiera all arrived at the school just a few minutes after the doors opened, they, just like everyone else that day, waltzed in the wide open front doors. Unlike some of the parents and family members, though, Terry was recognized by numerous people throughout the halls that morning. As a frequent volunteer at the school and member of the PTA, Terry was greeted by multiple fellow PTA parents as she, Kyron, and Kiera made their way to room 213, which was Kyron's classroom. They stopped briefly in the classroom to drop off Kyron's jacket and his backpack before he then excitedly led his stepmother and his little sister to his display. And again, multiple people remember seeing Kyron and Terry at the science fair. I mean, he was hard to miss, standing in front of his project and just beaming with pride. He obviously felt so accomplished with how well it had turned out. Terry even captured a photo of Kyron standing and smiling ear to ear in front of his red-eyed tree frog board. And I really probably shouldn't say this, but look how incredible Kyron's board looks in comparison to the board next to his. I know that's mean, I'm sorry, but it goes to show how much work Kyron put into this board and how passionate he was about science and about this project. Shoot, the kid's wearing a CSI shirt. He'd gotten the shirt from the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry when they hosted a temporary forensic exhibit the previous fall, and he had begged his parents to take him to see the exhibit, and he'd left that day with that shirt as a souvenir. You really can just see the joy and the excitement radiating from him as he posed for that photo. And he had a lot to be excited about. Obviously, school was almost out. He was going to spend that summer camping and fishing and boating and hanging out with his mom and his stepdad just as much as he could. He had less than a week of school left at this point. And let's be honest, we all know that the last week of school, especially in elementary school, is always super fun and totally laid back. So it makes total sense that he was walking around with this adorable giant smile on his face. And just knowing all of the plans that he had and all of the things that he wanted to do with his family and what a fun summer he was supposed to have. It just makes the outcome like it just twists the knife even more. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the breakdown was, like minute by minute, for how long parents were allowed to be at the science fair, but I do know that students were supposed to be in their classes by 10, and in between the parent tour and class starting for the day, the children were supposed to go around the fair in chaperone groups in order to view all of the projects. So the children were supposed to go to their classrooms, where they would then be broken down into groups, which were to be chaperoned and closely monitored as they were guided around the entire science fair for about an hour or so. At least that's my understanding. So if I'm correct in that understanding, or even sort of on the right track, let's say that parents, grandparents, and other miscellaneous adults were supposed to leave by, I don't know, 9, giving the kids about an hour to go around the fair before they were supposed to start class at 10. Let's go with that, she says with very wavering confidence. Look, all I know for sure is that Terry claims to have left the school right around 8:45. She says that she left so quickly that morning because Kiera had been dealing with an earache, so she planned to leave the school and head to Fred Meyer to pick up Tylenol for her. So as she was leaving, she claims to have left Kyron to head to his classroom on his own, while she and Kiera made their way out the front doors and to their car. However, before she actually left the building, she does assert that she saw Kyron make it up the steps and to his classroom, even though they had gone up completely separate sets of stairs located like halfway across the school from one another. Now, not surprisingly, I've never been in Skyline School, but from how my brain processes information, it sounds like there's 2 staircases on separate sides of the building that both lead to the same main hallway. Both of those staircases go between the 1st and 2nd floors, and according to Terry, she and Kyron each ascended one of the staircases at basically the same time. She even claims that she was able to wave to him, presumably right before he entered his classroom, just as she was about to head out of the building and down to the parking lot. And if you're like me, that was probably really confusing to have all of that thrown at you without any context. So I actually found a blueprint of the school. Therefore, we about to get some context up in here. So Kyron's classroom, room 213, Miss Porter's class, from what I've seen is somewhere right around here. And I don't know where Terry and Kyron exactly chose to part ways, but considering the fact that they both had to ascend staircases to get where they needed to be, they were obviously on the lower level of the school. So I would assume that Kyron took this staircase while Terry walked down the hall and made her way up this staircase. Then once you're up the steps, as you can see, you can either go out the front door or you can go up this second step of like mini steps here, and that will give you a clear shot either way down the main hall of the school. So this is where Terry claims that she was standing when she looked to her left down the hall towards the west end of the school, where she was able to see and wave to Kyron before turning around and leaving the building. Hopefully that helps, and I didn't make it more confusing by trying to make it less confusing. Realistically, I'm sure you would have understood the story just fine without the hour I spent on that project and those edits, but I'm a visual person, so I figured if I was gonna look all of this stuff up to help me comprehend it, I might as well share it with the class. Because the few times I heard the description of the school and everyone was just word vomiting at me, I can't comprehend information like that. Anyways, I have spent way too much time on the layout of this damn school, so let's move on. So Terry and Kyron part ways. They make their way to the main floor of the school. Terry manages to catch a glimpse of Kyron at the top of the stairs. He's about, 150 feet, give or take, away from her. And according to her, he was just about to go into his classroom. They wave to each other. I guess in her mind, she's done her parental duty in making sure he's made it to his class. And so with Kiera on her hip, she turns and heads out of the school on her way to her car. Well, actually out to Kane's truck. Yeah, that is something that a lot of people have scrutinized in the years following Kyron's disappearance, that morning, seemingly out of the blue, Terry wanted to drive Kane's truck rather than her signature flying squirrel mobile or whatever the fuck it was. Now, Terry's explanation for this was that she didn't think that Kyron's poster would fit into her car, which, sure, it probably wouldn't have. However, what's weird is that Kyron had already brought his display to school on the bus the previous day, so they didn't have to cart it there that morning when she brought him to school. And then Kyron was scheduled to ride the bus home from school that day, the day of the science fair. So at no point that day would Terry have had to try to fit the project into her car. Unless maybe she thought she was going to have to take it home for him following the science fair. I mean, as a mother, I'll go out on a limb and say that a miscommunication with a second grader It's probably not totally outside the realm of possibility, but it is definitely more widely believed that Terry is responsible for Kyron's disappearance. So people speculate that she purposefully set it up so that she could take Kane's truck that day because it was significantly more inconspicuous than her bright red Mustang. And that would mean that she could much more easily fly under the radar completely unnoticed. Regardless though, Terry's true motive, like much of this case, is left open to interpretation. Terry claims she loaded her daughter into the truck, left the school, and made her way to Fred Meyer, just kicking off her errands for the day. Frustratingly though, Terry claims that the first Fred Meyer she stopped at, which was about 5 miles south of the school on Northwest Embry Drive, they didn't have any children's Tylenol in stock. So she ended up having to go to a second Fred Meyer, which was a few additional miles southeast on Southwest Walker Road. And that's where she claimed she was actually able to get Kira her pain medicine. Once she had the medicine and she'd given Kira her dosage, she made her way seemingly all around town to complete the remainder of her tasks for the day. She would later state that after Fred Meyer, she dropped off her dry cleaning, she stopped at a craft store to pick up a few things, and then she drove around for a while trying to get Kira to fall asleep. And although this can't possibly be confirmed with any certainty, Terry claims that she was on this cruise from about 9:40 until just before noon, meaning that there's about 2-ish hours, give or take, of Terry's day that is kind of a mystery to everyone. Obviously, she claims she wasn't doing anything nefarious, but no one can confirm seeing her again until 11:40 that morning. That is when she dropped Kira off at her gym's daycare center so she could go and work out. And this part of her story can be confirmed through multiple friends of hers who she did speak with at the gym that day. They corroborate that she was there throughout the time frame she claims she was. Oh, and it can obviously also be confirmed by the record that Kira had been in the daycare that day as well. And according to the friends that Terry spoke to, nothing about her that day seemed out of the ordinary at all. She told them all about the science fair that morning, all about Kyron's project, and she even took out her phone so that she could show them the picture that she'd taken of Kyron in front of his project that very morning. There was no reason for anyone to believe that anything out of the ordinary was going on that day. Meanwhile, though, back at Skyline Elementary School, Kyron Horman was nowhere to be found. Like I said, all of the students were supposed to be led around the science fair in groups and chaperoned back to their classes where their teachers would complete roll call right at 10 a.m. However, despite multiple people having seen Kyron at the science fair that morning, and despite claims that a few of his friends had even seen and talked to him that day, by the time Miss Porter took her class's attendance for the day, Kyron was unaccounted for. And you would think that if Kyron was marked absent when he should have been there, that the school would have alerted someone, right? Kane, Desiree, Terry, someone in the family should have been notified of the fact that he was not where he was supposed to be. Lord knows we've probably all gotten one of those calls when either we accidentally forgot to call in and let the school know that our kid wouldn't be there that day, or we get the call from the school that tingles our spine because it's telling us that our kid isn't there even though we dropped them off that morning and we watched them walk into the building. But now we're being told that they're not there even though they're supposed to be there, so we call the school back in an absolute panic, barely able to get out our words through the cold sweats that have taken over our body, only to be put on hold as our anxiety mounts and our vision starts to blacken into a full-blown panic attack, just as the secretary comes back on the line to let us know that there was a mistake, that your kid's teacher marked your kid absent instead of the kid above them being marked absent, who was the actual absent kid. So after all of that, your kid is actually perfectly fine sitting in school where they belong, which is a relief, but now you have to throw out your soiled underpants for no reason. You know, that call. No? Just me? Well, I've seen 2 different stories reported as to why none of Kyron's 4 parents received that call. I saw one source state that the unexcused absence automated phone system wasn't working that day, but far more frequently, I've seen it reported that the phone call never went out to the Hormans or the Youngs because Kyron's absence was actually put into the system as excused. Yeah, evidently, Terry had emailed Kyron's teacher a few days before the day of the science fair and told her that Kyron had a doctor's appointment to go to on June 4th. Therefore, when Kyron wasn't present for roll call that day, it didn't raise any alarm bells for his teacher because her expectation and understanding was that Kyron wouldn't be in class that day. Now, Terry claims that that's incorrect and that Kyron's appointment was actually scheduled for the following Friday, June 11th. But if that was the case, that raises similar questions to the whole, why did Terry take Kane's truck the morning of the science fair thing? Because say Kyron's appointment really was scheduled for the 11th. The Friday of the science fair was the last Friday of the school year. So if he was going to be at a doctor's appointment a week later, well, that would not have mattered in the slightest to the school, as summer break would have commenced by that point. Understandably, this miscommunication has frustrated a lot of people because it really doesn't make sense. Therefore, it's led people to believe that Terry was intentionally vague or purposefully misleading regarding the date of Kyron's appointment so that it would go unnoticed if he was absent after the science fair. Again, I guess it's open to interpretation. So once Terry finished her workout and finished catching up with her gym friends, she picked Kiera up from daycare, and that's when they made their way home. I think she was at the gym for like an hour, so that would put her back home right around 1 o'clock. And I don't have a lot of information surrounding what she supposedly did from that point to when she was scheduled to pick Kyron up from the bus stop. I do know that at 1:21, she posted the picture that she'd taken of Kyron at the science fair to her Facebook, because if there was one thing Terry loved to do, it was to brag about her perfect life and her perfect family on Facebook. And I'm actually fairly certain that she was still on the computer around 2 when Kane got home from work. Reportedly, the two then ate a late lunch together before they made their way with Kiera to Kyron's bus stop right around 3:30. The three of them went to the bus stop, they stood there, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited. They waited as each and every other child for that stop descended the bus steps until no other kids were left. Confused, they approached the bus and they waved down the driver. And just as they were about to ask if Kyron was still on the bus, the driver actually cut them off and told them that Kyron had never boarded the bus that day. And obviously, this sent them into a panic, as it would any parent, and the bus driver alleges that Terry and Kane were no exception. They barely even finished speaking to the bus driver before they had taken off back towards the house to call the school. They spoke to Skyline School Secretary Susan Hall, who they claim was the first person to inform them that Kyron had not been present for school at all that day. And this is like 4:45 at this point. So if Terry's claims that she last saw Kyron at 8:45 are accurate, Kyron has been missing for like 7 or 8 hours at this point, but no one knew he was missing until right now. And I genuinely cannot even imagine the terror and hysteria that I would be feeling in that moment. It truly makes me sick to my stomach. I've had experiences where my kid is a few minutes later than usual coming out of the school building, and that gives me the cold sweats. So I cannot imagine finding out that my child has been unaccounted for like 8 hours, and I did not know. It is nauseating. Frantic and desperate for answers, Kane and Terry hopped in the car and they raced to the school as fast as they possibly could. And meanwhile, as they were on their way, Susan Hall, the secretary, she began making phone calls, the first of which was, to 911. And then once she had completed that call, that is when she had the gut-wrenching task of relaying the news of Kyron's disappearance to Desiree. This call was made just before 4:30, just as Terry and Kane and the police all began arriving at the school. And it should go without saying that upon hearing that her son was missing and that he'd been missing for hours, Desiree was absolutely distraught, especially considering that she was still hours away from Portland in Medford. I mean, we all know how important the first few hours of a missing persons case are. I'd consider that point to be fairly common knowledge. But even back in 2010, Desiree, of all people, was more than aware of that fact, considering that her husband, Tony, was a police detective. So knowing that so much valuable time had already passed and that there were still hours standing between her and helping to search for her son, I cannot imagine a more helpless feeling on earth. After speaking to the secretary, Desiree then called Terry and she demanded that she tell her everything about the day, everything about Kyron, everything about what she knew, just everything about everything. And so in painstakingly vivid detail, Terry began going over all of the things I've just gone over with you. That morning, the drive to the school, science fair, the wave at the top of the steps, Fred Meyer, the Tylenol, Michael's, the car ride, the stop at the gym. And this actually all struck Desiree as odd because although Terry was recounting her day like minute by minute in excruciating detail, for some reason her story still sounded so vague. And what also struck Desiree was that Terry wasn't crying during that conversation. She didn't sound emotional. she didn't even sound upset. Here, Desiree is barely able to even think straight, but on the other line, Terry, who just sounds cool as a freaking cucumber, seemingly does not have an ounce of worry in her voice. And while, as outsiders, it's really not possible for us to offer any judgment against Terry on her affect throughout this time frame, Desiree, on the other hand, knows Terry personally and has for years. And throughout the entire time she was listening to this story, all she could think was one thing. Over and over and over again. She's lying. She couldn't believe it. Here her son was missing, and her husband's ex-wife, who was supposed to be responsible for him, in her opinion, was lying straight to her face. Well, I mean, they were on the phone, but you get it. And even more unbelievable than that was the fact that Desiree told Terry she was leaving Medford and that she'd be in Portland in 4.5 hours. And Terry, at this, sounded surprised. She was like, "Oh, you're coming here? Yeah, bitch. It's not like you lost a pencil. You lost this woman's son. Like, what are you talking about?" Desiree got the call from Skyline just before 4:30, and before 5:10, she and Tony were on the road en route to Portland. Meanwhile, back in Portland, additional police officers from the Portland Police Bureau, as well as the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, began arriving on scene at Skyline Elementary, as well as at the Horman's residence. The school also sent out a message to all of the families across the entire district, alerting them that Kyron had not arrived home from school that day and that he was considered to be missing. Within just a few hours of Kyron not walking off of the bus that afternoon, multiple law enforcement agencies were already investigating his disappearance. A widespread search and rescue effort was being coordinated, and the FBI had also been contacted. Law enforcement, as well as school faculty, had done a preliminary search for Kyron throughout the interior of the building pretty much right away. However, a trained and experienced search and rescue crew didn't arrive to the school until just after 8 p.m. And then for the next 3 hours, an in-depth and comprehensive search of Skyline School, as well as the Horman residence, was completed. We're talking storage areas, classrooms, bathrooms, crawl spaces, you name it, they searched it. But sadly, they were unable to find any traces of Kyron. Well, that's not totally true. They did end up recovering his backpack and his jacket from his classroom, but what I meant was they weren't able to find any traces of where he was or what might have happened to him. Fortunately for them, Terry was chock full of ideas on what could potentially be going on. From the idea that Kyron was maybe kidnapped by a suspicious janitor, to the theory that Kyron had wandered off into the woods surrounding the school in hopes of finding a tree frog for his project. It was like she was in a competition with herself to outdo each of her own theories with an even more far out and outlandish one than the one before it. And while I don't know that anyone else was quick to shut her down, Desiree sure was. She was very outspoken in her belief that the theories that Terry was coming up with were just completely unrealistic. In her opinion, Kyron was just too shy and too timid and too introverted to ever just wander off alone. However, much to Desiree's dismay, throughout the course of this investigation, she would find out that Kyron actually did have a habit of wandering off. Apparently, the school had actually already lost track of him on at least 2 separate occasions prior to the situation they were currently in. As the night wore on and tensions mounted, Desiree eventually snapped and went completely off on Kane. She blamed him for the situation they were in, she blamed him for the fact that Kyron was missing, and she told him that once Kyron was found and everything was resolved, that she was taking full custody from him. She told him that she would be taking her son back to Medford with her, and that if Kane knew what was good for him, he would just let her do it and he wouldn't fight her on it. I mean, things were just really, really tense, and understandably so. This family had an incredibly complicated dynamic as it was when things were going well. So now in the face of such a living nightmare, let's just say that lines in the sand were more prominent now than ever before. And having to try and mitigate the tension between the family on top of trying to conduct such a difficult and complex investigation, to call this an uphill battle would be like the understatement of the year. I mean, just look at the land and the terrain surrounding this school. You could search that thick-ass forest area for years and probably not even make a dent. By Sunday, when there were still no signs of Kyron, Hundreds of students and parents of Skyline School all made their way to the school to see what they could do to help. Whether it was answering questions, passing out flyers, or volunteering for search parties, one thing I can say for certain in this case is that the community really did come out in droves to try to help support this family and to help find Kyron. Meanwhile, police, while continuing to search the school property and the surrounding area with sniffer dogs, also began looking into members of Kyron's family. More specifically, they began looking into Kane and Terry. They thoroughly examined Kane and Terry's vehicles, they searched their home and their property multiple times, and they even brought scent dogs out to help aid them in those searches. They really were trying to be as thorough as humanly possible, but it seemed like no matter what they did, they could not catch a break. And actually, one of the things that made their search with the sniffer dogs so incredibly difficult was Terry, because in the midst of everything that was going on, she had still been dutifully completing all of her household chores, including laundry. In a very short window of time following Kyron's disappearance, it seemed as though Terry had washed every piece of clothing that belonged to everyone in the house, including Kyron's jacket and backpack that had been left in his classroom the morning he went missing. So despite having the sniffer dogs available, they really couldn't seem to find much in the way of a sample of Kyron's scent to give them. It was as if Terry had managed to, purposefully or not, erase every single molecule of Kyron's scent that had ever existed in that house. And in my opinion, that's not something that happens on accident. Like, that seems like something you have to try to do, but I digress. Overall, the initial active searches for Kyron lasted for 10 days, and they consisted of over 1,300 searchers coming from as far as Washington and even California. So much time and so much effort was poured into trying to find Kyron that at the time, the search and rescue efforts in his case were deemed to be the largest in Oregon history. Initially, Kyron's disappearance was widely believed to simply be a missing persons case. However, by the 10th day, police were beginning to shift their mindset from a missing persons case to a criminal investigation. Throughout the first few days of the search efforts, when morale and optimism were still high, Kyron's blended family did seem to keep to themselves. They declined numerous requests from the media to put out a public statement. However, as the days went on, with still no sign of Kyron, on June 9th, the family did appear for a press conference in which both Tony and Kane gave statements to the press. Tony spoke first, beginning his statement by speaking directly to Kyron, telling him how missed and how loved he was and just how desperate everyone was to find him and to bring him home. He then extended a heartfelt thank you from the family to law enforcement, to search and rescue teams, and to the community volunteers that had selflessly given up their time to help search for Kyron. And then after Tony spoke, he introduced Kane as he stepped up to make his statement. Again, Kane acknowledged the gratitude and appreciation that the family had towards everyone up to that point who'd stepped up in any way to aid in either the investigation or in the search for Kyron. And he also expressed his gratefulness towards the media for their diligent effort to keep Kyron's name and face front and center in the public eye. Both of the men's statements were full of emotion, and they're heartbreaking and incredibly difficult to watch. But while watching it and knowing the backstory of the family, I do have to say that one thing did strike me as very odd while watching this press conference. And that was Terry and Desiree. Behind the podium that the men were giving their statements at, you can see Terry with her arms tightly wrapped around Desiree, holding her as if to comfort both of them. And as an outsider, you might think, wow, look at these two families coming together as one during this difficult time. And I can actually promise you that my oldest child, his stepmother and I might actually behave like that if, God forbid, we ever found ourselves in a similar situation. Her and I have a great relationship, and I genuinely appreciate that woman and the role that she's taken on in my child's life. That said, though, Terry and Desiree, they have it like that. Understandably so, given how Terry and Kane's relationship started. Desiree never was all that keen on Terry. They were never friends. They really weren't ever even friendly, let alone huggy and outwardly affectionate towards one another. So what maybe looked to people unfamiliar with the family and their dynamic like a tender moment between two grieving and struggling mothers, to Desiree, it felt incredibly weird and uncomfortable and frankly performative. And over time, that performance has certainly been picked apart by Terry's critics, claiming that she was feigning her support, that she was trying to put on an act to appear as if she was just as taken aback and just as hurt by Kyron's disappearance as the rest of his parents were. When in actuality, a majority of people believed that she knew exactly where Kyron was and exactly what had happened to him. And as the case went on and the investigation progressed, one by one, police began ruling people out. They ruled out every known sex offender in the area. They ruled out everyone who'd been at the school the morning of the science fair. And each time they would exhaust a lead, they would work diligently to generate and to follow a new one. But no matter what, it seemed like the only avenue that they could not rule out was Terry, which coincidentally was the single lead that Desiree was desperate for them to pursue. Obviously, we already know she was suspicious of her from the very first phone call, and her suspicion had only grown throughout this whole ordeal. From Terry and her never-ending theories to witnesses who came forward and told Desiree that they actually saw Terry and Kyron leave the school together the morning he supposedly disappeared, Desiree has pretty much always believed that for whatever reason, Terry is to blame for the disappearance of her son. Sure, police had already looked into all of Kyron's parents following his disappearance. Duh. I mean, that's investigation 101. And while on the surface, it appeared as though each and every one of them had a solid alibi for the time frame that Kyron went missing, the only one that had any unaccounted for time was, in fact, Terry. Through surveillance footage and receipts, they were able to confirm bits of her alibi, like her trips to Fred Meyer and her stop at the gym. But obviously, there was no way to prove where she was throughout the 2 hours that she claims to have been aimlessly driving Kiera around. So had she done something with Kyron throughout that chunk of time? I mean, he definitely had not been with her when she'd gone into any of the stores that morning, nor when she'd gone to the gym. So she would have had to have done something with him either in the time between when she left the school and went to the first Fred Meyer store, which is unlikely considering there would have been very little time for her to have done something like that, given the time she left the school and the time she was seen at Fred Meyer. Meaning that the most likely time frame that she would have had to have done something to Kyron and to make him disappear would have been throughout the 2-hour time frame between 9:40 and 11:40. And I'll tell you what, if Terry is innocent, she's gonna have one of the worst strings of luck I've ever seen. Because it is like everything she tries to do to clear her name backfires and ends up making her look way more guilty. She even agreed to take 2 separate polygraph tests, both of which she failed, which honestly doesn't really mean anything because we all know that polygraphs aren't foolproof. And it actually has been determined that Terry likely failed due to a hearing impairment that she had versus like definite deception. But we all know that when someone fails a polygraph test, regardless of their inadmissibility and their less than perfect track record, people are still going to side-eye someone that fails one. It's just human nature, especially when it's regarding such a serious matter and such an already seemingly suspicious person. Terry would end up being questioned more than any of Kyron's other parents, and while she has never been formally named as a suspect in his disappearance, she definitely seems to have felt the most heat from investigators. And like I said, everything she did and everything she said always ended up backfiring on her. Like, for example, the time she tried to incriminate her landscaper in Kyron's disappearance. Yeah, she told police that her landscaper gave her the creeps, that he'd come on to her before, and that ever since she'd been afraid of him and what he might be capable of. However, when police spoke to the landscaper, he had a very different and very interesting story to share with them. First of all, he denied coming on to Terry as well as having anything to do with Kyron's disappearance, as Terry tried to imply he might have. Then he went on to really blow police's hair back by telling them that like 6-ish months, give or take, prior to Kyron's disappearance, Terry had approached him and offered to pay him a large sum of money to kill Kane. Not to repeat myself, but this woman either is the dumbest, messiest criminal ever, or she has got just the worst luck. Obviously, she vehemently denies these claims, swearing that no such conversation ever took place. But by that point, the damage to her reputation, as well as to her marriage, it was done. On June 26th, Kane decided to pack up his things, as well as Kiara, and to move them out of the house that he shared with Terry. From there, he also went on to file not only for divorce, but also for a restraining order under the Family Abuse Prevention Act. Kane was ultimately granted full custody of Kiara, given that Terry was being investigated for trying to set up a murder for hire. However, she was never arrested or formally charged with anything. Actually, the landscaper ended up recanting his statements against Terry, and he accused the police of coercing the accusation out of him under the threat of deportation. Yeah, this shit is messy, it's dramatic, it's a lot. Honestly, who knows what to believe at this point? Maybe Terry's a terrible criminal and has the worst luck on the planet, because I mean, god damn. After losing custody of Kiara to Kane, Terry did temporarily file a motion requesting visitation rights with her, but not surprisingly, Kane was ferociously against the idea of Kiara being alone with Terry. For starters, it's alleged that Terry had actually tried to kidnap Kiara at one point. She tried to pluck her right out of the gym daycare one day while Kane was busy working out. And on top of that, Kane argued that he did not believe that Kiara would be safe with Terry. He cited her alleged alcoholism and the fact that he believed that she was severely emotionally disturbed and an unfit parent. So before he would even entertain the idea or the thought of allowing Terry visitation with Kiara, he insisted that she be subjected to a mental health evaluation. And what's very interesting is that as soon as the idea of a mental health evaluation came up, Terry voluntarily withdrew her request for visitation. But even after losing her husband and her daughter, Terry still had a way of making sure that she was never truly alone. As soon as Kane moved out of the house they shared, Terry actually ended up having a friend of hers named Dee Dee Spicer move in his place. Now, granted, she was only there for like 2 weeks, 11 days actually, I think it specifically was. But even still, it is very reminiscent of when Desiree moved out of she and Kane's house and Terry moved in after her just mere minutes later. Same kind of swapperoo here, only there was nothing romantic between Terry and Dee Dee. At least not that we know of for sure. However, it is definitely a rumor that I've seen float around. So I guess if anything, Terry goes both ways, because I do know for sure that she definitely loves her some peen. And I know this because following her separation from Kane, text messages were leaked that took place between Terry and one of Kane's friends named Michael Cook. And these are not just your average run-of-the-mill text messages. No. These are super icky and perverted, debaucherous, giggity messages, if you catch my drift. Don't worry, I'll spare you the details, because frankly, I wish I hadn't have found them. But the important takeaway is that, if you'll remember, Kane left the home on June 28th. Well, these messages appear to have started at the very latest on June 30th. Now, Terry has said in more recent years that she was only involving herself with Michael as a way to get back at and to hurt Kane, which at the very least is like mad insensitive considering the fact that he's already hurting due to the fact that his son is missing. But a lot of people have read into this even further, arguing that the fact alone that Terry could even think about sex, given what was going on around her, well, it definitely negates her argument that she loved Kyron like he was her very own. Because he hasn't even been missing for a month, and this woman is out here sending titty pics and other explicit material instead of trying to help find this missing boy. This boy that she helped raise and claims to have loved as if he were her own. It is just very obvious that from jump, Terry has been focused solely on her own appearance and her own needs. We didn't even need the nasty text messages pulled from her phone and leaked to come to that conclusion. However, something that they pulled from Terry's phone that is seemingly very important were the cell phone location pings from the morning of Kyron's disappearance that placed Terry roughly 6 miles from Skyline Elementary at a place called Suave Island. Suave Island is an island, that is made up of 26,000 acres of marsh and farmland located where the Willamette and Columbia River meet. Those rivers then combined and flow 100 miles northwest to the Pacific Ocean. And according to investigators, Terry's cell phone pinged off of a tower near Suave Island at 11 a.m. on June 4th. So right smack dab in the middle of the mystery time frame that Terry claims she was joyriding around with Kiara. Now, prior to the discovery of these cell phone pings, parts of the island had already been searched, but it's safe to say that the searches definitely intensified once it was discovered that Terry had been in that area the morning that Kyron disappeared. Search and rescue teams did their best to search as much of the land as they could, on top of sending divers out into ponds and marshes and tributaries. And this was all while a National Guard helicopter flew overhead. Overall, the island was searched multiple times, with hundreds and hundreds of searchers contributing to the efforts, but obviously the searches have always been unsuccessful. And honestly, it's not surprising. I mean, look at it. I can't even begin to imagine how truly difficult it would be to effectively search an area like this. Now, Terry claims that her phone only pinged in the area because that was part of the route that she had taken to try and calm Kira down, but this has been looked at skeptically because not only is Suave Island not really near the Fred Meyer stores or near Terry's gym, but Terry had initially told police that she didn't remember the roads or the route that she had taken that morning. But now that they have potentially incriminating evidence against her, all of a sudden her memory is crystal clear. Miss Ma'am, I'm not really even 100% sure what you're trying to do, but I am 100% sure that you're really bad at it. Honestly, that's probably why law enforcement has long suspected that if Terry is to blame for Kyron's disappearance, then it's more than likely that she had an accomplice. But who? Who do police suspect would help this awful woman carry out her awful plan? Remember Dee Dee? It's her. Like, police think it's her. I'm not saying it's her. But I'm also not saying it's not her. Obviously, I don't know anything for sure, but much like her good friend Terry in the wake of Kyron's disappearance, Dee Dee certainly seemed at every turn to make herself look hella suspicious. For starters, she was incredibly difficult for police to deal with. She refused to cooperate with them in any way and was even accused of possibly trying to keep other people from speaking to or cooperating with police. So right off the bat, Dee Dee girl, we are not off to a great start. But even with the immense public scrutiny that came with her relationship with Terry and her outward support of her, Dee Dee seemed unwavering in her assertion that Terry was not responsible for Kyron's disappearance. She even agreed to an interview with People magazine so that she could show her support on a national scale, telling journalists, quote, "If I thought for a second that she was capable, I would not have been there. She would not have been my friend in the first place." Now, when she says I would not have been there, I assume she means she wouldn't have moved in for those 11 days because she denies being with Terry at all at any point on the day that Kyron went missing. However, another big problem for Dee Dee is that despite providing an alibi for her whereabouts on June 4th, much like the alibi her friend Terry, her alibi conveniently cannot be confirmed or refuted by anyone. Dee Dee claims that on June 4th, 2010, during the time frame in question, she was gardening at West Wind Farm Studio, which is a lavender farm / perennial nursery located on Old Germantown Road in Portland. There was a tour scheduled to take place on the property the next day, so Dee Dee was supposed to be working there to help get the property ready. And while Dee Dee claims that she never once left the property that day, other employees and volunteers that were there that day have come forward claiming that when they called her for lunch that afternoon, they couldn't find her. All in all, Dee Dee's whereabouts are unable to be confirmed from about 10 o'clock that morning to 1 o'clock that afternoon. So if she and Terry really were in cahoots and were both involved in Kyron's disappearance, that would give them about an hour or so, give or take, that their unaccounted for times overlap. Obviously, Dee Dee refutes this theory, claiming that the only reason she missed lunch was because she had been on the opposite end of the property from most of the other volunteers, and that she had left her phone in her car near the main house while she'd been out working that day, and so she hadn't realized what time it was, which caused her to miss lunch. Now, my assumption is that they likely did pull location data from Dee Dee's cell phone at some point in the investigation in an effort to corroborate her claims that it had been in her car on the property the whole time. However, there's a chance that even if it had, that might not have actually rendered Dee Dee as off the grid as she'd like everyone to believe. And what I mean by that is later it would come to light that following Kyron's disappearance, Dee Dee and Terry communicated primarily via burner phones that they purchased. This way they could communicate without running the risk that their calls were being listened to. Because it was common knowledge at that point that pretty much everything Terry did was being watched and tracked and documented. But were they communicating via burner phones prior to and throughout Kyron's disappearance as well? Well, Your guess is as good as mine. To clarify, the idea that Dee Dee was perhaps involved somehow is by no means far-fetched, like tinfoil hat kind of speculation. This is something that law enforcement took incredibly seriously, even going so far as to print flyers with photos of Terry and Dee Dee and Kane's truck in hopes of jogging someone somewhere's memory. But unfortunately, much like all of the other efforts in this investigation, this avenue, too, has fizzled out over the years. Since Kyron's disappearance, there have been close to 700 different searches organized, spanning over 100,000 acres of land. Police have followed thousands of different tips and leads, and in doing so, have conducted just shy of 4,000 interviews. There have also been multiple grand juries convened over the years, with close to 50 different witnesses called to appear before them. However, in spite of all of that, here we sit, over 13 years having passed since Kyron's disappearance, and devastatingly, police don't appear any closer to solving this case now than they were in 2010. On June 1st, 2012, Desiree filed a civil suit against Terry, seeking $10 million in damages, arguing that she was responsible for Kyron's disappearance. And by this time, Kane was very outspoken in sharing the belief that Terry was involved in Kyron's disappearance. However, I have to imagine that he'd come to this conclusion much, much earlier on. Ooh, fun fact, Dee Dee was deposed for this lawsuit on October 5th, and during her deposition, she ended up pleading the fifth to almost 150 questions. 142 to be exact. Frustratingly though, after about a year of proceedings, Desiree opted to drop the lawsuit against Terry in an effort not to interfere with the ongoing criminal investigation into what had happened to her son. It is just so annoying that, like, no matter what avenue they take, they cannot seem to hold this woman accountable. Now, that's not to say that in the years following Kyron's disappearance, Terry has gone on to live like a happy and carefree life. Rather, it appears as though she cannot help herself from getting into more and more trouble. In 2015, Terry finally left Oregon and moved to Northern California to try and start fresh. However, within her first year in California, Terry found herself in handcuffs on no less than 3 separate occasions, spanning from gun charges to domestic violence to possessing a stolen vehicle. This woman simply cannot get her shit together. Granted, over the last few years, she has gotten remarried and she has managed to keep her name out of the spotlight, aside from her connection to Kyron's case and her publicly perceived guilt in his disappearance. But it does seem as though she's maybe gotten less sloppy over the last few years. 2016, though, that was a very bad year for Terry, because not only was that the year she kept getting arrested, but it was also the year that she made a giant ass out of herself by going on the Dr. Phil show. I'm sure she thought she was going to go on there and spew a bunch of bullshit and try and clear her name and fix her public image, but once again, she ended up leaving the set of the show looking far more guilty than she had when she arrived, if you can believe that. Ugh, I don't know, man. It is just really unfortunate that the apparent downhill trajectory of Kane and Terry's marriage likely ended up costing sweet, innocent little Kyron his chance at life. Looking into this case, I'd make the assumption that, I don't know, like 85% of people who do look into it believe wholeheartedly that Terry is guilty. Bear in mind, I pulled that statistic right out of my butt. Like, obviously, there's no way for me to accurately quantify a percentage like that. But I can say that the overwhelming majority seems to believe that Terry should be behind bars. Even people who don't research this case to the extent that I have tend to end up leaning towards Terry being guilty. And I really think that that just boils down to the fact that she's, like, an objectively unlikable person. However, there is a very small percentage of people that I've seen that believe Terry is innocent and that she's been unfairly and unjustly railroaded and hyperfixated on. And I feel like whenever I see people advocate for her innocence, they always seem to fall back on the same argument. What was the motive? People who think that Terry is innocent feel as though there has been no reasonable motive presented that could lead someone to think that she would do something like this. And to that I say, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Now, obviously, we know that Terry and Kane's relationship fell apart insanely quickly after Kyron's disappearance. I mean, less than a month after he was last seen, Kane had moved out, taken their daughter, filed for divorce, and for a restraining order. But what's interesting is that, according to an email that Desiree sent the night before Kyron went missing, their relationship was in trouble even before any allegations began being levied against Terry. During their investigation, police stumbled upon an email that Terry had sent to a friend of hers in which she explained that she was planning on leaving Kane filing for divorce and taking Kiera. And apparently she was planning on doing all of that the next day. So the day that Kyron went missing. But you may be wondering, how is this a motive for Terry to make Kyron disappear? Sorry, I know that I'm long-winded, but I promise I'm getting there. So say Kyron hadn't gone missing the next day, and say that Terry had gone through with her plan to take Kiera and leave Kane. I think it's safe to assume that at some point, legal custody arrangements would have had to have been made for Kiera, right? That, I think, is where Terry's motive to make Kyron disappear comes into play. And I say that because in Oregon, when deciding a custody arrangement between two parents, the court first and foremost considers what arrangement they believe would be in the child's best interest. And one thing that they do not like to do is separate siblings from one another. Courts are reluctant to separate siblings, half-siblings, and or step-siblings, unless there are compelling reasons to do so. Which begs the question, with Kyron around, would Kane be looked on more favorably when it came to who would receive primary custody of Kiera? I mean, it is sickening to think that a person would even entertain the idea of killing an innocent little boy. For what? Just to stick it to their ex-husband? Gross. Not completely unbelievable though, considering it fits right into the statement that Kane made following his split from Terry, in which he condemned her for putting her own needs above everyone else's, even above the children's. At any rate, where does this all leave us today? What does the amalgamation of all of this information boil down to? Well, first and foremost, obviously and devastatingly, Kyron is still missing. Desiree, however, has made it known that she has no plans on giving up fighting for her son, and someday, somehow, she will find the answers that she's looking for. She is still heavily involved with the investigation and with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, who, by the way, have stated that the case remains open and active even all these years later. They state that Kyron's disappearance has had an unwavering and profound impact on the community, and that they know how desperate everyone is for answers. And police are hopeful that with advances in software and digital forensics and geospatial technology, that eventually they will be able to make significant advances in the investigation. Terry, to this day, continues to maintain her innocence, vehemently denying having any involvement in Kyron's disappearance. And although she has never been formally charged, or I don't even think she's ever formally been named as a suspect, it is definitely safe to say that in the court of public opinion,
Guilty.
And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Do you think that Terry has been unjustly focused on and blamed all of these years, or do you think that the public scrutiny she's faced is warranted? Do you think she's responsible for Kyron's disappearance and probable murder, or do you think that the majority of us are on the wrong track completely? Personally, as if I haven't made it abundantly clear throughout the entirety of this video, I definitely think she was involved. In my opinion, it's just really the only thing that makes sense. But even with that said, and this next part is going to be physically painful for me, but I do think that law enforcement has done the right thing by not pursuing official charges against her yet. Because once you put someone through a trial, that's it. You only get the one shot. And unfortunately, right now, I just don't think that they could prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt with what they have. And I have to imagine that that's their exact mindset. I'm sure that they want her charged every bit as much as the general public wants her charged, but sometimes law enforcement has to play the long game in order to facilitate the right outcome. Yeah, it is super unsettling that Terry's been out and free for all these years, and I figure if they had enough to get a conviction, they would have charged her already, so best not to rush to trial and risk a potential acquittal. Honestly though, what bothers me more than anything about this whole case is that it really feels, sometimes when you're looking into it or reading about it, like Kyron's gotten lost in the salaciousness and the drama of it all. From affairs and divorces and lesbian lover rumors and hitman rumors and the feud between Desiree and Terry, not to mention the constant emphasis put on money and the amount that was being spent on the investigation. I don't know, it just seems like people are dangerously close to forgetting that in between all of these juicy details, there is an innocent little boy who was robbed of his chance at life. A life that likely would have been long and happy. Kyron was a sweet, smart, ambitious, amazing little boy, and it is absolutely heartbreaking that he never got to grow up that he never got to become a police detective. And what hurts the most is that he and his family never got a proper opportunity to say goodbye to one another. Desiree has stated that shortly after Kyron's disappearance, she felt both his presence along with God's presence as Kyron delivered her a message. She believes that he was trying to comfort her and to let her know that he was okay and that he wanted her to be okay too. And whether you believe in that kind of thing or not, whatever the case may be, wherever he is, I just hope that he's resting peacefully and that somehow, some way, he's aware of just how much of an impact he's made on so many people. Anyways, yeah, like I said, let me know what you guys think down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. And thank you so much to our mystery friend for requesting this one. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form I have linked down in the description box. And if you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos almost every week. My typical schedule is to try to post for 4 consecutive weeks and then take a scheduled skip week. But my plan for the rest of the year is a little bit different. I think what my plan is for the remainder of the year is to post every week until the last week of the year. I'm going to skip the last week of the year and the first week of the year for the holidays. And then I should be back on my 4 weeks and then a skip week schedule. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Oh, and thank you for bearing with me with my technical issues, and hopefully, I don't know how this video is going to look. I don't know if it's going to be different in any way, but thanks in advance for just, chugging right along with me. Bye, guys.